Chapter 1. The Bloom at Brayfield Hall Spring. Arrived early that year in the village of Brayfield St. Clement, slipping quietly into the hedgerows and stirring the orchard trees to bloom a fortnight ahead of schedule. The grounds of Brayfield Hall, always the pride of the parish, were in full splendour, white blossom and pale pink petals drifting lazily in the breeze, like a scene plucked from a painting. It was the sort of morning that inspired sighs and strolls, and the sort of weather no hostess could resist, and so it was that Lady Horatia Winfield, widowed, wealthy, and possessing a laugh like a rustling crinoline, had announced her intention to host the first Bloom tea beneath the orchard canopy. "It's tradition," she declared, raising a fluted glass at the vicarage luncheon the week before. "And this year the trees are nearly poetic." She was right. Tables were arranged between the trunks of ancient apple and pear trees, bunting strung like ribbons through branches, and lace cloths pinned neatly beneath the tea sets. The guests arrived in good cheer. The vicar and his wife, the ever-watchful Miss Giles, young Dr. Vincent Elwood, recently returned from London, and Miss Marple, who had been invited as an honorary visitor of great charm by Lady Horatia herself, though it was suspected by many that the elderly woman from St. Mary Mead had been included chiefly because she made such excellent conversation without ever needing to raise her voice. Miss Marple sat beneath a crabapple tree, her blue wool shawl folded neatly about her shoulders, and her hands occupied with a piece of delicate lacework. She sipped her tea, listened politely, and above all, watched. Lady Horatia fluttered from table to table, issuing remarks like trailing perfume. Crispin brought the shortbread from Bristol, she cooed to the vicar's wife, "though I swear it's no better than what cook makes." Crispin was her nephew and heir, and he stood now by the orchard gate, sharp-shouldered and slick-haired, exchanging dry conversation with Daphne Gray, a journalist visiting the village to write, a feature on rural traditions. "Odd sort of thing writing about us," muttered Major Linley, retired and half-deaf, "as if sheep-shearing and jam competitions haven't existed since the Bronze Age." "She's very modern," whispered Miss Giles, adjusting her hat feathers, "trousers and opinions." Miss Marple said nothing. She had watched Daphne Gray arrive. She had watched how the younger woman's eyes lingered not on the orchard, but on the bell tower across the grounds. An odd thing, perhaps, to note at a garden tea. But Miss Marple did note it. She also noted that Crispin's smile, when it came, did not reach his eyes. The afternoon passed with gentle music from a string quartet, scones and remarks on the early bloom. It might have gone down as one of Lady Horatia's better affairs, were it not for the bell. It rang at precisely 3:47. One long, clear toll, deep and unexpected, rippling through the orchard like a ripple through silk. Conversations ceased. Heads turned. The bell, housed in the old orchard belfry, hadn't been rung in years. Not since the war. It was said to have been part of the original hall chapel, long since deconsecrated and turned into a garden folly. Now it stood with ivy up its sides and dust on its ropes. No one had a reason to ring it, and yet it had rung. Lady Horatia blinked. "Perhaps a child," she said uncertainly, "playing where they shouldn't." The vicar looked concerned. "It's a steep climb." "I'll check," offered Dr. Elwood, already setting off. Miss Marple quietly folding her lace into her handbag, rose without comment. The others waited, some returning awkwardly to their scones, others whispering. A few minutes passed before a cry echoed across the orchard. A voice, sharp and startled. "Someone's here!" There was a rustle of movement. Chairs scraped, feet hurried. Miss Marple walked at her usual measured pace, following the narrow, gravel path to the base of the belfry. Inside, it was cool and musty. Dust hung in the sunlight like smoke. Dr. Elwood stood just inside the stone doorway, his back to her, his shoulders taut. When he turned, his expression told the story before. His words could. "There's a body," he said quietly, "up there at the bell." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes shifted to the stair. The belfry tower rose in a spiral, and there, halfway up, just visible from where she stood, was a figure slumped beside the bell frame, limp, unmoving. Daphne Gray, the police were called. 4:15. Inspector Gerald Mottram had arrived from the district office in a smart coat and sharp mood. He ordered the area sealed, the guests accounted for, and the body removed with the proper care. "Neck broken," he said grimly. "Could have fallen, but—" He glanced at the thick hemp rope beside the platform. This was gripped, firmly, recently. There'd skin under the fingernails. He turned to Lady Horatia, who stood white-faced near the gate. She had no reason to be up there, did she? Lady Horatia shook her head, then faltered. She was asking questions earlier, about the bell, said it was unusual. I didn't think. Inspector Mottram looked toward the belfry. "Well," he said, "it's more unusual now." Miss Marple stood quietly to one side, unnoticed by most, her gaze turned upward. Not to the bell, but to the orchard, and to the guests, and to one guest in particular, who had vanished from the crowd at the moment of the bell's toll, and only returned once the others had begun to stir. She noted that. She also noted the slight smudge on one wrist cuff, and the faint scent of lavender oil on the stair. The sun had begun to lower by the time the body was taken away. A gentle wind passed through the orchard, shaking petals loose like falling ash. Miss Marple sat once again beneath the crabapple tree. Her lace remained in her handbag. She did not knit, because the game, now, had begun, and someone in Brayfield had rung the bell for murder. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. The morning after the orchard bell tolled for the last time, the village of Brayfield St. Clement stirred with the careful choreography of people pretending not to gossip. But gossip they did. At the bakery queue, at the post office window, at the allotment gate and the steps of St. Clement's Church, the talk flowed, not in frenzied outbursts, but in soft murmurs and meaningful glances, like the rumble of distant thunder on a cloudless day. "It's a terrible thing," said Mrs. Pickering, whose scones were routinely denied prizes due to an excess of clove. To die like that, at a tea party no less, no sense of decorum any more. "She was snooping," said Mr. Fellows, the greengrocer. "Journalist, you know, always asking questions." "Yes, but up there." Mrs. Pickering shivered. "In that dreadful old tower. Why would anyone climb it?" "Looking for a story," muttered Mr. Fellows. "Found something else instead." The implication hung in the air like mist on a moor. Miss Marple, meanwhile, paid a quiet visit to the vicarage. not to pry, never that, but to offer condolences. The vicar had been fond of the orchard bell, often describing it as a romantic relic of better-built days. Now it would forever carry an echo of death. "It's shaken everyone," Reverend Miles said, stirring his tea with more force than necessary. She was different, of course, but that's hardly a reason. His wife, Margaret, placed a hand gently on his. "She asked a great deal about the hall's history," she said, glancing at Miss Marple. "And the bell tower." Miss Marple raised a polite eyebrow. "I thought she was simply eccentric," Margaret added, "but it's rather unsettling in hindsight. She mentioned something about the original chapel records. Wanted to know who had access during the war." "The war?" Miss Marple repeated gently. Said Reverend Miles. "During the Blitz, Brayfield Hall took in several evacuees, some military men too, I believe. The chapel was used as a temporary storage site and, briefly, as a refuge." Miss Marple nodded, tucking that away like a spool of fine thread. "And Lady Horatia?" she asked. "Rattled," said Margaret. "Very much so. She's cancelled next week's poetry evening. You know how she values routine. She hasn't cancelled an event since the rationing committee discovered she'd hoarded Madeira." Miss Marple smiled faintly, then rose. "Thank you both. You've been very kind." Outside the lane was quiet but watchful. Curtains twitched. Footsteps slowed. People noticed Miss Marple when she walked, even if they pretended not to. They called her "Dear Jane," "Clever Miss Marple," even "Our Village Sleuth," when in high humour. But they knew well enough that her presence meant something had shifted, and something had. Daphne Gray's death was no accident. Miss Marple had seen the position of the hands, the angle of the head, the unnatural stillness that did not suggest a fall, but a quiet, brutal finality. At noon, Inspector Mottram convened a formal meeting with several of the guests from the tea party. They assembled in the west drawing-room at Brayfield Hall, beneath a portrait of Lady Horatia's great-grandfather, who had famously won a duel in France over the misplacement of a snuff-box. Lady Horatia sat at the head, gloves in her lap. Gaze, brittle Crispin, ever immaculate, stood by the drinks tray, mixing soda water as if nothing had occurred. Major Linley dozed quietly in the corner. Dr. Elwood paced. Miss Marple sat with her shawl neatly folded, eyes lowered, knitting set aside. "I won't pretend this isn't delicate," Inspector Mottram began. "Miss Gray's death occurred on private property during a social function. The coroner's initial report lists cause as cervical fracture due to abrupt trauma. However, there are signs inconsistent with a mere fall." "Signs?" Lady Horatia asked sharply. Mottram glanced at his notes. Gripping marks on the bell rope. Scratches on the stair rail consistent with being pushed. No external injuries save for the... Chapter 3. Early Investigation. Miss Marple always said that the trick to investigating murder in a village was not to interrogate people, but to let them talk, preferably over sponge cake. People, she believed, had a way of revealing the truth when they thought they were merely being polite. And so, 2 days after the orchard bell rang out, she invited Miss Giles for tea. Miss Giles was the self-declared keeper of Brayfield's moral ledger, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper sense of propriety. She knew everything, or believed she did, and Miss Marple suspected she might, quite unintentionally, have witnessed something important. They sat in Miss Marple's cottage parlour, a cheerful room of crocheted doilies and quiet ticking clocks. The conversation began with jam. Miss Giles declared blackcurrant a frankly overused preserve, and then moved gently to the topic of Miss Daphne Gray. "I never cared for her," Miss Giles said, stirring her tea as though it had done her a personal injury. "Those shoes, trousers at a formal tea, and the way she asked questions, so direct, London manners." "What sort of questions?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Oh, all sorts of peculiar things. Wanted to know who'd stayed at Brayfield Hall during the war. Asked if the bell had ever been used for anything other than services. Can you imagine? I told her it was used to call the gardeners in the old days. Probably hasn't rung in 40 years. And was she interested in the hall itself, or in Lady Horatia's family?" Miss Giles hesitated. "Well," she said slowly, "she did ask about Crispin." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "Only in passing," Miss Giles added hastily. "Said she'd seen his name in an old registry of military officers and wanted to know if it was the same person. And was it?" "Oh, I shouldn't think so," Miss Giles said, then leaned forward. "But I'll tell you something. Crispin didn't like her, not one bit. I saw his face when she tried to speak with him, like someone had dropped vinegar in his gin." Miss Marple smiled. "Well, thank you. That's very helpful." After Miss Giles had gone, Miss Marple sat quietly, thinking. It was not the first time Crispin's name had come up in connection with Daphne Gray's inquiries, and now the added note about a military record piqued her interest. She reached for her telephone and rang her nephew Raymond, who still had a few connections in the civil service. "Darling," she said sweetly, "I wonder if you might do a little look-up for your old aunt. Something quite minor. A military record, just a name, really." The next day she took a walk through the village. At the post office she inquired after stamps. At the grocer's she asked after flour. At the baker's she lingered over an apple tart, asking whether the Bramleys had come early this year. "Done. Each place," she observed. "People were jumpy, not from fear, but from uncertainty. The murder had not landed on someone obviously disreputable. No theft, no broken window, no hint of lunacy. Just a woman asking questions, and a bell that should never have rung. The unknown made people nervous. That afternoon she made her way to Brayfield Hall. The servants were clearly under instructions to treat her kindly. Lady Horatia had always admired Miss Marple's discretion, and in moments like these, discretion was currency. She was shown into the morning room, where the French windows looked out over the orchard. The trees were beginning to lose their blossoms, and the grass below was littered with fallen petals. Lady Horatia entered a moment later, looking composed but drawn. "My dear Miss Marple," she said with forced brightness, "how lovely to see you, though I must assume this isn't purely social." "I'm afraid not," Miss Marple said gently. I had hoped you might indulge a few questions." Lady Horatia sighed and sat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Ask what you must." "Miss Gray's inquiries, did they concern your late husband?" Horatia blinked. "You? I don't." "Believe so. She mentioned the war, said she was tracing wartime stories. She asked about the bell tower. I told her what I could. that it was sealed for a time, used as a lookout briefly during the bombing raids. Did anyone use it regularly? Only the groundsman, I believe. And Crispin's father once stored a few supplies there when he was working with the Home Guard. But really, Miss Marple, I haven't set foot in that place in years. Miss Marple nodded. You were seen speaking rather firmly with Miss Grey the morning of the tea. Horatia's mouth tightened. Yes, I asked her not to include the hall's name in whatever article she was planning. I told her this was a private event, not a village fete. Miss Marple's tone remained pleasant. And what did she say? She smiled, Horatia said slowly, and said I was welcome to dispute it. In print, later that afternoon, Miss Marple sat with Dr. Elwood in the village square. He had agreed to join her for a short walk, citing a need to step away from paperwork. They sat on a bench beneath the war memorial, a peaceful spot where the clock tower chimed every hour. I imagine this has been trying for you, Miss Marple said kindly. It has, he admitted. It's the first death I've seen here that wasn't by age or accident. Do you believe it was murder? He hesitated. Yes, he said finally. The angle of the break, the bruising, it wasn't a fall. Do you know who might have done it? No, he said, but I know someone's lying. She looked at him, waiting. Crispin, he said quietly. He said he was in the orchard the entire time, but I saw him walking away from the tower shortly after the bell rang. He looked pale, distracted. He didn't see me. I was over by the hedgerow, but I saw him. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Did you tell the inspector? I didn't want to accuse him, Elwood said. Not without cause, but something wasn't right. Miss Marple smiled gently. Dr. Elwood, sometimes the truest thing a person says is what they don't say. That evening, Raymond telephoned. There was a Crispin Winfield listed under the Royal Signals Corps, he said. Service number matches the time Miss Grey would have found. But here's the curious thing. His record stops abruptly in 1944. Disciplinary hearing. No public record of what for. Redacted. Honourably discharged, but not without. Whispers. Marple thanked him and hung up. Then she returned to her notebook. At the top she wrote, Crispin Winfield, dishonour, witnessed at tower. Knew Daphne was investigating. Then below that, lavender oil, Horatia, or someone borrowing her signature. And finally, a third line, the bell sees everything. But who saw the bell? She closed the notebook. The pieces were beginning to turn. And someone, very soon, would slip. Chapter 4. First Suspects. By Thursday morning, the rhythm of Brayfield St. Clement had been utterly disrupted. The market was half its usual size, the WI knitting circle had been postponed, and the bell tower had been boarded, up by order of Inspector Mottram until further notice. Nothing stirred conversation like a death, especially one as inconveniently placed and publicly performed as Miss Daphne Grey's. And now, whispers had turned towards suspects. "Between you and me," muttered Mr. Fellows behind a basket of parsnips, "I'd wager it was the doctor. Comes back from London full of stories, probably with a whole trunk of skeletons." "Don't be ridiculous," hissed Mrs. Pickering. "It's always the quiet ones. That Crispin boy has a look about him. Cold, like a cat deciding whether to scratch. Doesn't drink in the pub either," added the baker. "Never trust a man who avoids the local ale. Miss Marple, passing through the square with a loaf of rye and a packet of cardamom, offered a polite smile and said nothing. She was not one to speak until she was sure, and even then often preferred the truth to reveal itself by its own weight. At Brayfield Hall, however, the tone was not of speculation, but containment. Inspector Mottram had returned that morning and requested a formal interview with both Crispin Winfield and Dr. Vincent Elwood, the two men last seen near the bell tower on the day of the murder. He began with Crispin. The young man entered the drawing-room with his usual composure, dressed impeccably in a navy jacket and tan trousers, the very picture of respectable detachment. Mottram gestured for him to sit. "Mr. Winfield, I'm going. To speak plainly," he said. "You told us you were near the orchard during the party, yet you were seen near the bell tower at the time of Miss Grey's death." Crispin crossed one leg over the other. "I had stepped away. For a cigarette. The orchard was crowded. I thought the folly might be quiet. Convenient timing. I wasn't aware the bell would ring, Inspector. Did you see anyone near the tower?" Crispin hesitated, then shook his head. "No one." "Did you speak with Miss Grey at any point that day?" "No. But you knew her?" "I'd met her, briefly. She introduced herself at the local inn the week before." "And what did she want?" "She said she was researching wartime activities in the countryside. I told her I had no involvement in that period, which is true." Mottram raised an eyebrow. "There's a military file bearing your name." Crispin's smile was thin. "There are many Winfields. I never saw combat. Your record was sealed, which makes it of no concern to you," Crispin replied coolly. Mottram made a note, but said nothing more. Dr. Elwood's interview was far less polished. He fidgeted with his cufflinks and avoided eye contact. His tone was earnest, but it lacked Crispin's self-possession. "Yes, I saw her," he admitted, "just before the bell rang. She was walking quickly toward the tower." "Did she seem agitated?" "No. Focused, maybe. Determined." "Did you follow her?" "No. I went around to check the south hedge. One of the children had twisted their ankle. By the time I returned, it had happened." "You saw Mr. Winfield near the tower?" "Yes." "And you didn't report it. I didn't think—" Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The bell tower at Brayfield Hall had always been more romantic in theory than in practice. From a distance it looked charming, ivy-covered, sun-dappled, and vaguely mythic. Up close it was a different thing entirely. The steps were narrow and crumbling, the beams warped by decades of damp, and the air smelled faintly of old rope and long-forgotten incense. Miss Marple arrived just after dawn, wrapped in her thick grey shawl, and accompanied by the housekeeper, Mrs. Wilkes, who had been tasked with unlocking the tower under Inspector Mottram's special permission. "I don't see what you expect to find, miss," Mrs. Wilkes muttered, fumbling with the heavy iron key. "The constables have been up and down already. There's nothing but dust and the old bell." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "but dust has a memory, if one knows where to look." The door creaked open. Miss Marple stepped inside. It was still and cold within, the air holding the hush of long silence. She ascended slowly, one hand on the rail, careful not to disturb anything that might prove useful. Halfway up, where the stair turned at a narrow landing just below the belfry itself, She paused. The wood here had a different feel underfoot. Not newer, but less worn. And then she saw it, a small panel, flush with the inner wall, slightly offset from the grain of the others, barely noticeable. She took a gloved hand and pressed. It moved, just a sliver. Inside was a hollow space, no more than a foot deep, and tucked within it, wrapped in old linen and bound with a crumbling ribbon, was a notebook. Miss Marple carefully drew it out and unwrapped the cloth. The cover was leather, worn, embossed faintly with the letters HW. She opened it. Inside, the writing was delicate and slanting, clearly a woman's hand. Dated from 1943 to 1945. Names, meetings, brief entries, sometimes no more than a sentence. Met again with Lieutenant M. Unsettling questions. The bell was rung after curfew. CW warned. The storage beneath is not secure. Suggest move. Miss Marple turned the pages slowly, each one a thread winding its way towards something larger. There were references to evacuees, to coded signals, to things hidden beneath the orchard cross. Then a final note. If this falls into the wrong hands, the bell will be the key. Let it toll when the truth is in danger. Miss Marple closed the book and held it against her chest. So that was it. Not just a journal. A record and perhaps a trigger. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had returned to her cottage and laid the journal across her desk. She read it through twice before folding a single page into her handbag and making her way to the vicarage. The Reverend Miles received her in his study, surprised but not unpleased. "I wonder," she asked after the pleasantries, "if you recall who was responsible for the maintenance of the bell tower during the war?" The vicar leaned back in his chair. "Why, it was Horatia's husband, Colonel Winfield. He considered it a matter of honour, said it had once served as a watch-point and should remain so. And did anyone else, perhaps someone in the village, have access to it?" Miles frowned. "Not officially. Though, I suppose, Crispin would have known. He was just a boy then, but his father often took him along. Taught him Morse code using the bell, so the stories go." Miss Marple nodded, satisfied. "And what about the orchard cross?" The vicar blinked. "That old stone marker. Dates back to the monastery days. Stands just beyond the last pear tree. Most people ignore it. Superstition, they say." Miss Marple smiled faintly. People rarely ignore superstition. They avoid it. That afternoon she paid a visit to Sidney Clamp, the postmaster. It was an uncharacteristic stop for her on a Saturday, but one she timed to avoid other customers. "Sidney," she said cheerily, "do you recall if Miss Gray received or posted any unusual parcels before her death?" Clamp adjusted his spectacles. "Let me see. I believe she sent something the day before the tea party. Slim parcel, tracked post, said it was going to a solicitor." "A solicitor?" Clamp nodded. "Somewhere in London. Kingsway address." "And she posted it herself?" "Oh, yes, stamped and sealed. Handed it to me personally. Said it contained insurance." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Thank you, Sidney. You've been quite helpful." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple placed a telephone call to Inspector Mottram, who arrived 2 hours later, somewhat begrudgingly. "Another theory?" he asked as he took a seat. "Not a theory," she said, handing him the journal. "A fact." He read in silence for several minutes. "Good Lord," he muttered. This changes everything." "She found it," Miss Marple said softly, "and she intended to use it. But she feared it would be destroyed or discredited, so she mailed a copy or an excerpt to someone she trusted. What we found was the decoy. What she sent was the match. And whoever killed her knew it," Mottram said. "Which means we need to find out who knew about this journal before the rest of us did." Miss Marple nodded. "And who feared that its contents would reawaken something long considered settled." Mottram stood. "I'll have the tower sealed again, and the orchard cross-examined. If the journal mentions something beneath it—" "It's worth looking," she agreed. As he left, Miss Marple stood by the window and watched the wind ripple through the orchard. The bell, silenced now, loomed in the distance, but it had already done its work. It had drawn attention to the truth, and someone, somewhere in the village, was waiting for the sound of footsteps approaching, knowing the secret was slipping from their grasp. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The discovery of the wartime journal had cast a long shadow over Brayfield St. Clement. Even if most of the villagers remained blissfully unaware, only a few now knew the truth. That Daphne Gray had uncovered something too delicate, too potentially explosive, to be allowed into the light. And so, Inspector Mottram, now properly unsettled, ordered a discreet excavation of the orchard cross, at Miss Marple's suggestion. The work was carried out at dusk, under the guise of foundation repair, by two trusted officers. By lantern light and careful spade, they revealed what lay beneath: a metal strongbox, rusted but intact. Inside, wartime papers, old letters in coded language, photographs of uniformed men, some local, some not, and a slim folder marked Confidential. Home Office. Mottram took the contents away under lock and key. But for Miss Marple, the damage was already done. She had seen one of the names, and it was still living. That same evening, Miss Marple paid an unexpected call to Lady Horatia. Winfield.Brayfield Hall was quieter than usual. The drawing-room was unlit, and Horatia herself answered the door in a robe, her famously sculpted hair slightly tousled. "Miss Marple," she said with forced composure, "what brings you at this hour?" "Truth, I'm afraid," came the gentle reply. Horatia said nothing for a moment, then gestured toward the parlour. "Come in." The fire had burned low. Miss Marple took her usual seat and waited, while Lady Horatia poured them each a modest glass of sherry. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin. "You know something." "I know quite a lot," said Miss Marple, "most of it unconfirmed, some of it deeply uncomfortable." Horatia stared at the fire. "Then let's be uncomfortable together." Miss Marple nodded. "Your husband was involved in coded communications during the war. He used the bell tower not just as a lookout, but as a message relay. That much is clear from the journal Daphne found. He did what was asked of him," Horatia said stiffly. "I've no doubt. But it's also true that someone in the village, someone close to him, was aiding enemy agents, passing messages perhaps. That's what the records beneath the cross suggest." Horatia turned sharply. "I never saw those records." "But you suspected?" She was silent. Miss Marple continued, "I believe your husband knew who it was, and I believe, to protect the family's reputation, he buried the truth, literally, sealed it beneath a symbol of the church. He left the journal as a last resort, in case things ever resurfaced. Horatia's voice trembled now. I was told it would never come back, that the past had been laid to rest. But it wasn't, Miss Marple said softly. Daphne Gray found the name, and she intended to publish it. Horatia raised her eyes. Do you know who it was? Yes, said Miss Marple, but I'm not here to accuse you, Lady Horatia. I'm here to ask for your help. Horatia stared. Help? There's someone else at risk, someone who doesn't know they're being watched, and someone else who's very close to panic. Horatia's hands clenched around her glass. Then she said, It was never meant to go this far. Miss Marple rose. It never is. The next morning Miss Marple requested a word with Dr. Vincent Elwood. She found him at the surgery, polishing his spectacles at the window. He looked tired, Miss Marple, he said. I've heard there's been developments. Yes, she said. Quite significant ones. He motioned her inside. What can I do? Miss Marple studied him a moment. You were born in Brayfield, weren't you? He blinked. Yes, I left after school, studied in London, but you returned recently. For the vacancy, he said. It felt right. And you knew Crispin as a child? He nodded. Slightly. He was older. Miss Marple stepped closer. Did you know Daphne Gray contacted your old university? He froze. What? She was tracing academic records. She found something odd. A file submitted under your name, but with a different birth date. She wondered why your degree had been reissued in a different year than your enrollment. Elwood swallowed. Why would she? She was thorough, Miss Marple said gently, and she had found inconsistencies. Because you, Dr. Elwood, are not simply Vincent Elwood. He dropped into the chair. I changed my name, he whispered. Chapter 7. Another Twist. The village of Brayfield St. Clement awoke to shrill whispers and running feet on Monday morning, the kind of scurrying usually reserved for bake sale emergencies or royal visits. But there was no bunting going up today. There was blood in the vicarage garden. It was Sidney Clamp, the postmaster. He had been found just after dawn by young Robbie Carter, who'd come to return a borrowed rake. Sidney was lying face down beside the rose trellis, his cap crushed beneath him, and his spectacles cracked on the gravel path. He was alive, but barely. Inspector Mottram arrived within 20 minutes, his coat askew and eyes darker than usual. He took one look at the scene, then turned sharply to Sergeant Reeves. Get Dr. Elwood, now. Miss Marple, who had been tending her petunias next door, arrived moments later, escorted, perhaps summoned, by Mrs. Carter, who believed Miss Marple was better than medicine when it came to these things. She took one look at Sidney Clamp and did what few others might have. She looked away from the body and instead began studying the ground. The gravel near the body was slightly disturbed, but not in the pattern of a fall, more like someone had been dragged. Her eyes followed the subtle scuff marks, back along the edge of the hedge to a low wooden gate that separated the vicarage garden from the path leading behind the old schoolhouse. A place few used, a place you could wait and watch. Dr. Elwood arrived shortly after and knelt beside Clamp. After a quick assessment, he looked up grimly. Concussion, 2 bruised ribs, possibly cracked, and... He held up the man's hand. Miss Marple drew closer. His palm was blistered, bruised, and burnt. The mark was shaped like a ring. No, a handle. Lantern, she murmured. Or kettle. Elwood frowned. Or something hotter. Mottram's brow furrowed. Someone tortured him. Or threatened to, Miss Marple said softly. Tried to get something from him. Clamp was moved to the surgery under strict watch. Mottram stood beside Miss Marple at the gate, the wind lifting petals around their feet like confetti at the wrong sort of wedding. "I don't like this," he muttered. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "because it isn't clean. Whoever did this wasn't silencing Sidney. They were extracting something." "You think he knew who killed Grey?" "I think," she said, "he knew something very specific, and that someone feared he'd finally said it out loud." Mottram turned toward her. "You said earlier you knew who it was. The one Daphne uncovered. Is it time to say it plainly?" Miss Marple hesitated, her eyes drifting toward the belfry. "Not yet," she said. "The truth is like good linen. It wrinkles if forced. But I believe I know the pattern now. All that remains is to tug the final thread." That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the belfry, alone. The boards had been removed after the earlier discovery, and though the tower still gave off the aura of solemnity, it now felt violated, like a memory no longer trusted. She climbed slowly, each creaking step carrying the weight of decades. She passed the place where Daphne had fallen, past the panel where the journal had been hidden, and at last reached the bell itself. She stood beneath it and looked up. The rope still dangled, but just above, near the beam that supported the frame, she saw something odd. A notch. No, not a notch. Carved letter, W. She turned slightly, and there, opposite it, another letter. M. She frowned. Together they meant little. But beneath each letter was a rusted hook, as if something had once hung there. A bell used for code. Hooks for flags. Lights. Messages. She descended again, deep in thought, and that was when she noticed the scuff mark on the floorboards near the base. A boot heel. Fresh. Later, she returned to the vicarage. Sidney Clamp had regained consciousness, though only briefly. Mottram allowed her a few minutes. Miss Marple took his hand. "Sidney," she said gently, "you were attacked. Someone wanted to know what you gave me." His eyes fluttered. "Miss," Marple leaned closer, "you left the journal alone, but they found you. What did they want?" He struggled to speak, but the words were barely whispers. "Not Belle." She held her breath. "The other." "What other?" His lips barely moved. "The boy." Then he faded into sleep. Miss Marple sat back. The boy, not the bell. She closed her eyes. It wasn't about what Daphne found. It was about who. That evening, she returned to Brayfield Hall. Crispin was in the library, sipping brandy by the fire. She looked up, unsurprised. "I thought you might come," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "You've been quite careful, but not careful enough." He gave a hollow laugh. "And what is it I've done, Miss Marple?" "You've built a life on a story that isn't yours," she said. "You've inherited not just the hall, but the history beneath it. You've tried to bury that history by removing anything that contradicted it. You think I killed her." "No," she said. "I think you knew what Daphne Grey had uncovered, and I think you told someone else, perhaps hoping they'd deal with it quietly. But you didn't account for fear. Crispin stood. If I'd wanted her gone, I'd have done it myself. I believe you, she said softly, because your guilt is not in the doing, but in the knowing. He looked away. Miss Marple turned to leave, but before she reached the door, she said one last thing. She wasn't going to name you. Crispin froze. She was going to name your father's brother. There was a long silence, and then Crispin whispered, I know. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple folded the photograph once more. The scratched-out figure, the one whose identity Daphne had threatened to reveal. The same man who had been quietly present in every record, but had never been named. The third soldier / captain, Edmund Winfield, Lady Horatia's brother-in-law, reported missing in action in 1944, but very much alive under a new name. And now someone else knew it too. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. Miss Marple had always said that some truths cannot be pulled like weeds. They must instead be allowed to sprout, watched patiently, and harvested when the time is right. Now, at last, the time had come. She had arranged quite deliberately for a small post-tea at the vicarage the next afternoon, under the comfortable pretence of checking in on poor Sidney Clamp's condition. The vicar's wife, Margaret, obligingly prepared ginger biscuits and lemon sponge, and invited a handful of those closest to the situation, as she put it, Lady Horatia, Crispin Winfield, Dr. Elwood, and Miss Giles. The idea was that an informal setting might ease tensions. Miss Marple, of course, had a different idea entirely. She arrived with a modest basket of preserves and a mind sharpened like a tailor's needle. Sidney Clamp, still weak, was resting upstairs. The guests were gathered in the drawing-room, teacups in hand, conversations hovering somewhere between cautious civility and brittle politeness. Lady Horatia, ever regal in her high-backed chair, wore her lavender shawl as though it were armour. Crispin stood near the fireplace, his expression unreadable. Dr. Elwood hovered at the sideboard, pouring tea with a nervous hand. Miss Giles, predictably, was ready to erupt with commentary at the slightest nudge. Miss Marple took her place beside the vicar's armchair and smiled pleasantly at the room. "How kind of everyone to gather," she said sweetly. "Brayfield has always impressed me with its communal spirit." Lady Horatia raised an eyebrow. "It's good for people to see each other. Rumours fester when we lock ourselves away." "Indeed they do," said Miss Marple. "And sometimes, of course, the truth gets locked away with them." The room fell still. Miss Marple looked directly at Crispin. "I had a thought this morning," she said, "about Captain Edmund Winfield." Crispin's cup clinked audibly in its saucer. "Oh?" Lady Horatia said coldly. "I fail to see how my late brother-in-law is of any relevance now." "That's just the thing," Miss Marple said gently. "I don't believe he is quite so late as he's been declared." Horatia's eyes widened, but she said nothing. Crispin's voice came out hollow. "That's absurd." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied. "He went missing in 1944, yes, but the journal Daphne discovered made several references to E.W. continuing to act as a liaison into early 1945. There are photographs, letters, mentions in Home Office logs." Crispin stood abruptly. "That doesn't mean he survived. Those files may have been mistaken. War is chaotic. True, Miss Marple agreed, but it becomes difficult to explain why a man whose service ended in France would be positively identified in a photo taken here, in Brayfield, 6 months after his supposed death. Lady Horatia's voice cracked. "Where did you get such a photo?" "From Sydney," Miss Marple said. "Or rather, from the folder Daphne copied and sent before her death. The same one someone tried to retrieve from him by force." Dr. Elwood set down the teapot with a shaking hand. I had no idea." "I believe you," Miss Marple said. "You're not part of this." She turned her gaze again to Crispin. "You knew, didn't you, that Daphne had found the connection? You saw the photo, recognized him." Crispin's mouth opened, then closed again. Lady Horatia stood slowly, every motion careful. "I did what I had to," she said. Miss Marple didn't move. "You knew he was alive." "Yes," he returned under another name. "Yes, he had secrets that could compromise the Hall's reputation." "Far worse than that," Horatia whispered. "He wasn't just a coward, he was a collaborator. He sent messages, passed information to the enemy. Hugh found out. He confronted him. But Edmund begged for silence, claimed he could make it right." "And so," Miss Marple said softly, "he disappeared." "Not by our hands," Horatia said quickly. "He left, fled, and we never heard from him again." "But someone did," Miss Marple said, "and someone kept the truth buried until Daphne arrived." Silence. Chapter 9. The reveal. It was nearing dusk when Inspector Mottram summoned the remaining suspects back to Brayfield Hall, under the pretence of clarifying statements. The orchard trees, now nearly bare of blossom, trembled in the wind as if remembering the sound of the bell that had once broken their stillness. Inside, in the same drawing-room where it had all begun, the small group gathered in uneasy silence. The fire flickered low, and rain tapped faintly at the windows. Crispin Winfield stood stiffly by the fireplace, pale and silent. Lady Horatia sat composed but grey-faced, her hands gripping the edge of her chair as if holding herself upright. Dr. Elwood watched from a corner, his features clouded by some internal reckoning. Miss Giles had not been invited, neither had the vicar, and of course Major Linley was absent. Only Miss Marple seemed at ease, seated by the window, hands folded in, her lap, her expression calm and unreadable. Inspector Mottram entered, rain still glistening on his coat sleeves, and closed the door behind him. "I've just had word," he said without preamble. "The train to Barrowmere was halted at Little Elling. Major Linley was on board, travelling under the name Edward Lang." A pause. "He's been taken into custody." The room did not erupt. There was no shouting, no outcry, only silence. Because by now the truth had begun to root itself in the minds of those present. Miss Marple nodded gently. "Then I suppose it is time to lay everything out." She stood, took a small notebook from her handbag, and addressed the room in her usual gentle, almost grandmotherly voice. "What I'm about to tell you," she said, "is not just the solution to a murder. It's the unravelling of a story that began nearly 30 years ago." She paced slowly, speaking with clarity and warmth. "Captain Edmund Winfield disappeared in 1944, presumed dead. But he wasn't. He had by then been implicated in covert communications, passing information to enemy agents using the bell tower here at Brayfield Hall. That much was suspected by his brother, Colonel Hugh Winfield, but never proved. She looked at Horatia. Rather than expose him and destroy the family, your husband allowed Edmund to vanish. In return, Edmund disappeared completely. He adopted a new identity, served briefly in another capacity under a different name, and eventually returned to Brayfield as Major Gerald Linley, a man supposedly retired from a distinguished military career. Crispin's voice was hoarse. But why here? Because this is where he had power, Miss Marple replied. Anonymity, yes, but also control. He knew the village, knew how to blend in. He took on quiet leadership roles, appeared dutiful, honoured, but always, always, he feared the past might return. She paused, and then it did, in the form of Daphne Gray. She found the journal, Mottram added, and the strongbox beneath the orchard cross. But it wasn't just the evidence, Miss Marple continued. She found the photograph, one that showed Edmund after his supposed death. She recognized his face, began asking questions, began putting together a piece meant to expose a decorated officer as a traitor. And that, Mottram said, sealed her fate. Miss Marple nodded. He followed her to the bell tower, confronted her, tried to frighten her. But Daphne wasn't easily frightened. She threatened to publish anyway. Horatia's eyes filled. So he killed her. Yes, Miss Marple said. A single push. Quick, quiet. And then he moved the envelope to confuse the timeline. There was a pause, but Miss Marple wasn't done. After that, he needed to know what else she had discovered. He went to the post office, realized Sidney Clamp had seen part of the correspondence she'd mailed to London. Sidney, being loyal, told no one, until he told me. And so Linley attacked him, Mottram said, tried to torture the information out of him. When that failed, he ran. Miss Marple closed her notebook. But the final thread, you see, came not from evidence, but from behaviour. From how Major Linley never once asked what Daphne was writing. From how he tried to shift suspicion onto Crispin with quiet suggestions. From how he slipped away from the tea party and was first on the scene pretending shock. She looked at Dr. Elwood. You saw him that day, didn't you? Elwood nodded slowly. I thought I was imagining it. He was behind the tower wiping, his hands on a cloth, Crispin whispered, and I never knew. No, Miss Marple said gently. You didn't. You believed in your family, in the myth of it. Lady Horatia lowered her eyes. I let him stay here. I let him haunt this place. You made a choice, Miss Marple said, one born of loyalty and perhaps fear. But it was never truly buried. The past has roots, deep ones. There was silence once more. Rain tapped gently at the windows. Then Mottram said, He'll face trial, for Daphne, and perhaps eventually for what he did during the war. Miss Marple nodded, but her eyes were distant. Later that night she sat by the fire in her cottage, her knitting folded beside her, untouched. She sipped her tea and stared into the flames. There was no satisfaction in this sort of victory, only stillness, and the knowledge that sometimes the truth did not set people free. It bound them, one to another, through choices made and chances lost. The bell had tolled for Daphne Gray. but it had rung long before that, for the sins of war, for the secrets people carried, and for the silence that followed them through time. And somewhere, in a drawer in her writing desk, Miss Marple slipped the photograph away, uncropped, unedited, all three men still visible. She would not forget, because justice in villages like Brayfield wasn't always about punishment. It was about remembrance, and Miss Marple never forgot. Chapter 10. The Aftermath 2 weeks after the arrest of Major Gerald Linley, formerly Captain Edmund Winfield. The village of Brayfield St. Clement tried in its way to return to normal. The bunting from Lady Horatia's ill-fated tea had long since been taken down. The string quartet hadn't been heard from since. The orchard, stripped of its spring blossoms, swayed quietly in the wind like a gathering of witnesses reluctant to speak. And yet, something had shifted in the soul of the village. The past had been unearthed, quite literally, and it had left its mark. The bell tower remained locked. The vicar, at Miss Marple's gentle suggestion, had draped a white cloth over the pulpit-shaped lectern in the hall's chapel. Not in mourning, but in acknowledgment. Something had ended, and something else had been reclaimed. Miss Marple, for her part, remained as active as ever, visiting the vicar's wife with homemade shortbread, attending the Wednesday sewing circle, and even offering her usual opinion on a particularly dubious custard recipe submitted for the autumn fair. But those who looked closely would have noticed that she now walked the orchard path more slowly, her eyes often lifting to the bell tower, with the gaze of someone looking not at a place, but at a memory. One morning, Crispin Winfield visited her cottage. He arrived without announcement, hat in hand, eyes downcast. Miss Marple offered him a seat, a cup of tea, and a silence that waited, without judgment. "I wanted to thank you," he said at last, "for seeing the truth, and not just the facts." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "There's a difference, you know. Facts tell you what happened. Truth tells you why." He nodded. "I still don't know what to do with all of it. My name, the hall, my uncle. You carry history, Mr. Winfield. That's a weight, but it's also a chance. A chance to do better," she said simply, "to build something out of the truth rather than lies." He looked at her, and in that moment he did not seem aristocratic nor powerful, just young and human. "I'll try," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "That's enough." At the post office, Sidney Clamp had recovered well enough to return to duty, albeit under the strict eye of Miss Giles, who now insisted on light tasks only, and made a show of lifting parcels herself to impress upon others the seriousness of the injury. Not everyone's cut out for espionage, she told anyone who'd listen. Sidney only smiled and weighed the stamps. The village, it seemed, was healing, slowly, in its own peculiar way. But not all wounds were public. That evening, Miss Marple received a letter. It had no return address, and the writing was unfamiliar, firm, precise, military. Inside was a single sentence. "You did not judge me. That is why I thank you." There was no signature. She folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside the photograph, now sealed in an envelope marked for Raymond. One day. Not all truths needed to be spoken aloud. One quiet Sunday, the vicar asked Miss Marple if she'd care to say a few words at the chapel. "I'd be delighted," she said. She stepped to the front and placed her hands lightly on the lectern. "I've lived long enough," she began, "to know that the past never truly leaves us. It stays, pressed between the pages of journals, locked behind old doors, buried beneath stone crosses." There were murmurs of agreement, but sometimes, she continued, the past rises not to haunt us, but to remind us that choices matter. That silence can be as dangerous as violence, and that truth, when spoken kindly, can be the most powerful thing in the world. She paused, then added softly, "Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it comes like a bell in the orchard. Quiet, unexpected, but never forgotten. The chapel was still. No applause, just breath and thought." Later, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, knitting in her lap, tea cooling beside her. The radio hummed faintly in the corner. Outside, the wind moved through the pear trees, and from far off came the sound of laughter. Children chasing each other along the green, their joy unbothered by history. Miss Marple smiled, because this was what mattered, not the tragedy, not the secrets, not even the cleverness of solving a murder.